the feudal system and the logic of punishment. To understand the punishments, we need to understand what feudal society was like. Feudalism was based on decentralization of power. There was no strong and centralized state as there is today. Each feudal lord controlled his own territory. Relations of personal dependence. Vassals swore allegiance to their lords. Peasants and serfs depended on the lord's protection in exchange for labor and tribute. Agrarian economy. Almost all wealth came from land, cattle, and crops. Within this scenario, the feudal lord was owner of the land, responsible for military protection, supreme judge in his fiefdom. In other words, for much of the Middle Ages, the law was the master. Typical crimes in the feudal context. The main crimes were linked to property, cattle theft, harvesting, tools, social order, rebellion of serfs, disobedience, abandonment of the fief, religion, blasphemy, heresy, witchcraft, honor, serious insults, adultery, betrayal. The legal mentality was not concerned with the rehabilitation of the criminal. The objective was reaffirm the authority of the Lord, the king, or the church, intimidate the entire community, to balance the social order broken by crime. Therefore, the penalty needed to be seen, felt, commented on, hence the importance of public punishments. How feudal justice worked in practice. In the feudal world, there was no unified penal code. The decisions were based on local customs, so-called customary law, oral traditions, religious principles, and often in the direct interest of the feudal lord. Manorial courts. At the center of this justice were the seigneurial courts. They were usually held in the main hall of the castle or in symbolic places of the fief. The feudal lord presided over the trial, sometimes assisted by counselors, elders, or officials. The witnesses were neighbors, peasants, other servants. There was no lawyer in the modern sense. The accused himself tried to defend himself when he had the chance. In many cases, the person's fame and the word of others outweighed any concrete evidence. Ordeals, when God was the judge. A typical practice of the period was ordeal, or God's judgment. The idea was simple. God would not let the innocent be condemned. Some examples. Trial of fire. The accused was to hold a red-hot iron or walk on hot coals. If the wound healed well after a few days, he was considered innocent. Water test. The accused was thrown into the water. If it sank, it was a sign of innocence. If it floated, it was seen as rejected by the pure water and therefore guilty. Proof of combat. God's judgment by duel. Two parties or their champions fought. The victor was seen as the one to whom God had bestowed justice. These methods show how much judgment was linked to the religious view and little to rational criteria. The Church, sin, and the Inquisition. The Catholic Church was the great moral authority of the Middle Ages. It not only guided people's faith, but also directly influenced legislation and punishments. Crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, practices considered pagan. They were treated as threats not only to religion, but to the entire social order. Ecclesiastical courts. The church had its own courts which judged clerics, priests, monks, bishops, heretics. Cases of marriage, annulment, adultery, consanguinity. Moral issues involving customs. In many cases, the accused could be excommunicated, that is, excluded from the community of believers, which socially was equivalent to a civil death. The Inquisition. With the advance of movements considered heretical, such as Cathars and Waldenses, the Inquisition emerged, starting in the 13th century. Features. He investigated rumors, denunciations, and suspicions of heresy. He kept the accused imprisoned, often incommunicado. He used torture as an accepted method to obtain confessions. He could sentence him to life imprisonment, hard labor, or death. The Inquisition delivered many convicts to secular power for the execution of the sentence, especially the stake. The so-called auto de fe were public ceremonies in which sentences were read, and often the condemned were burned in front of the population. Corporal punishment and public humiliation. Not all punishment involved death, but many involved pain and humiliation. Flogging. One of the most common punishments. The condemned was tied to a stake, column, or log. He received whippings on his back, buttocks, or legs. The number of scams varied according to the crime. It was an intermediate penalty, cruel but not necessarily killing. It served to punish and mark psychologically. Mutilations. The logic was symbolic. Thieves could have their hands cut off. Slanderers and traitors could have their tongues torn out or pierced. Some criminals were branded with red-hot irons, mainly on the face or shoulders. This social mark was almost a lifelong sentence. Everyone knew that that person had already committed a crime. Pillory and public shame. The pillory was a stone or wooden column, usually in the main square. There, the condemned man was imprisoned, exposed to the derision of the population. He received insults. He could be the target of spitting, food scraps, stones. In some regions, he would spend hours or days in this position. The goal was clear, to make shame a central part of punishment. Nobility and honorable punishments. Medieval justice was profoundly unequal. The penalty depended on both the crime and who committed it. Privileges of the nobles were considered of superior blood. Therefore, they were rarely tortured in a degrading way. Mutilations that would dishonor the lineage were avoided. When sentenced to death, they received a more dignified execution, such as beheading. A knight or feudal lord convicted of treason, for example, could to be beheaded with a sword or axe in a formal ceremony, to have their arms and coats of arms destroyed in public as a symbol of loss of honor, to have their land confiscated, affecting the whole family. The punishment, therefore, was also political. The king or other lord showed that no title was above loyalty, the worst forms of execution. Here we enter into the most extreme punishments, generally applied to crimes considered unforgivable: treason, heresy, murder, rebellion. Hanging, very common for peasants, thieves, and common criminals. Held in squares, hills, or near the walls. Sometimes bodies were left hanging for days to frighten passers-by. Beheading, faster and cleaner, often used on nobles. When the executioner was inexperienced, a single blow was not enough, causing horror in the public. Quartering penalty applied in cases of high treason. The condemned could be hanged until he almost died. Then his body was divided, either by horses, tearing off limbs, or by cuts. Body parts were displayed in different parts of the kingdom. This practice reinforced the message, whoever defies the king is destroyed entirely. Impalement. Although more associated with certain regions of Eastern Europe, such as Wallachia, it is an extreme example of cruelty. The condemned man was crossed by a stake. Death was slow, turning the execution into a spectacle of terror. Bonfire. The bonfire became the ultimate symbol of religious punishment, applied mainly to heretics and witches. It was seen as a way of purifying the body by fire. In some cases, the defendant was strangled first, so as not to feel the fire. In others, he burned to death. The stake was not only the death penalty, but a ritual act surrounded by prayers, sermons, and speeches. Witches, heretics, and the devil's fear. From the late Middle Ages and into the modern age, persecutions of alleged witches intensified. Who was considered a witch? Many victims were poor, widowed, or lonely women, healers and midwives who used medicinal herbs, people with behaviors outside the religious or social standard. The belief was that these people made pacts with the devil, cast curses, or affected crops and livestock. Witchcraft trials. Accusations from neighbors, often out of envy or personal conflicts, were enough. Birthmarks, scars, and blemishes were seen as devil's marks. Absurd evidence, such as the water test or the search for insensitive points on the body, were used to prove guilt. Torture was widely used to extract confessions. In extreme pain, many would confess anything just to end their suffering. Joan of Arc, a symbolic case. Joan of Arc, a French peasant, claimed to have visions of saints and led troops in the 100 Years' War. Accused of heresy and witchcraft, she was tried by an ecclesiastical court and sentenced to be burned at the stake in 1431. Centuries later, she would be recognized as a saint. This case shows how religion, politics, and justice were mixed in the choice of punishments. The torture machines. The imagination of the time created several instruments to interrogate and punish. Wheel of smash. The condemned man was tied to a large wooden wheel. Limbs were struck with bars or hammers. In some cases, the wheel was held up for public display. Cradle of Judas. Pyramid-shaped structure. The accused was suspended and supported on the tip. The weight of the body caused intense pain and internal injuries. Foal, or easel, bored with pulleys. Hands and feet were seized and pulled in opposite directions. Joints could be dislocated. Thorns chair. Chair with metal tips on the seat, backrest and armrests, sometimes heated over a fire. The defendant had to remain seated during the interrogation. These instruments had a dual function. Punish. Breaking psychological and physical resistance to obtain truth and confessions. Inequality in punishments. Nobles, clergy, and peasants. The same infraction could result in very different penalties, depending on social class. Peasants and serfs. They suffered the cruelest and most humiliating punishments. They could be flogged, mutilated, imprisoned, executed in public hangings. They had little or no chance of defense. Clergy, judged by ecclesiastical courts. He often escaped severe corporal punishment. He could be sent to monasteries, cloistered, or suspended from religious functions. Noble, more formal trials. Honorable penalties, exile, confiscation of property, beheading, rarely subjected to pillory or whipping. This inequality reinforced the central message of the feudal system. Everyone has their place and must remain in it. Regional variations in feudal Europe. While certain patterns were common, there were differences between regions. France. Strong presence of manorial and ecclesiastical courts. Exemplary punishments in times of war, as in the 100 Years' War. Active participation of the Church in trials of heresy. England. Gradual development of a more formal legal system with itinerant judges and royal courts. Written laws began to gain more importance. Punishments such as hanging and quartering were common for treason. Holy Roman Empire. Great political fragmentation. Each city or principality could have its code and practices. Judicial torture was widely used in criminal proceedings. Iberia. Strong performance of the Inquisition, especially from the end of the Middle Ages. Persecution of Jews, Muslim converts, and alleged witches. Autos de fe have become public spectacles. From feudal cruelty to modern justice. Over the centuries, the reinforcement of kingdoms, the growth of cities, and the emergence of new philosophical ideas began to transform the view of crime and punishment. Criticism of torture and public executions. Philosophers and jurists began to question the effectiveness of torture in obtaining the truth, the inhumanity of public executions, the arbitrariness of penalties. In the 18th century, thinkers such as Cesare Beccaria argued that penalties must be proportional to the crime. Justice must be swift and certain, but not cruel. The goal should be to prevent crime, not to avenge it. Over time, many forms of torture were prohibited. Public executions have decreased and in many countries have been abolished. More rational and universal penal codes emerged. But the legacy of the feudal period remains a historical warning. When power is concentrated without limits, and justice is blindly mixed with fear and fanaticism, cruelty finds justification. The worst punishments of the feudal system are not just macabre curiosities of the past. They are a reflection of, as humanity has already used fear to control, how pain has been normalized as an instrument of justice, how religion, power, and entitlement can merge in dangerous ways. Today, we have laws, human rights, and more organized courts. But the history of the Middle Ages reminds us that justice can become institutionalized violence when it is not limited by ethical principles and respect for human dignity. If this dive into the dark justice of the feudal system moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. And answer there in the comments. Do you think that our current justice is really that different? Or did it just change the form but keep the essence of fear and power?